Hey guys, fancy seeing you here. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all having an incredible day. In today's Mystery Monday, we're going to be talking about the granny killer. So right off the bat, you know this guy is going to be an absolute peach, just going around killing little old ladies in his spare time. Top bloke. Before we get into the case, I just want to thank today's sponsor, Audible. I feel like I don't need to tell you guys how much I love Audible. I'm obsessed. I feel like you know this already. I'm currently listening to And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, which is like a mystery thriller type audiobook, which I'm really enjoying so far. And if you love a good mystery or thriller, which I have a sneaking suspicion you might if you're here watching Mystery Monday, then I would definitely recommend giving it a listen. The best part about listening to audiobooks is that it just makes them feel so real. It's so immersive. It's the best part. It's why I love audiobooks so much. And honestly, it's the only way I consume nonfiction because it's like listening to a podcast. It's so good. I'm super excited because the next audiobook I'm going to listen to is I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which is about the Golden State Killer. I'm so excited to listen to that one and actually really want to do a Mystery Monday on it after I finish listening to it. So let me know if that's something you guys would be interested in. But Audible seriously has something for everyone, and members get access to their Plus catalog, which gives you thousands of titles of audiobooks, Audible originals, podcasts, guided fitness and meditation, and even sleep tracks. It's amazing. And members get 1 free credit every single month, which is good for audiobooks in the premium selection, in the bestsellers, and the new releases, and you get to keep it forever. So if you guys are interested in checking it out, you can get a 30-day free trial if you go to audible.com/Bellafiore, or you can also text Bellafiore to 500-500. I will leave all of the information in the description down below, and let's go ahead and get into today's case. So the granny killings began on the 1st of March in 1989. 82-year-old widow Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill lived alone in a small apartment on Military Road, which is like the main street in Mossman, and Mossman is like a pretty well-off suburb in Sydney. Around mid-afternoon, she walked from her apartment to the local shops, and she left the shops to walk back home at around 4 p.m, and just as she got to the front door of her apartment, she was attacked. A couple of boys were visiting some family in the block of apartments that Gwendolyn lived in, and as they left, they discovered her body in a pool of blood. She was barely alive and she was visibly shaking, and I just can't imagine how traumatic it would be for everyone involved, including those boys, because they knew Gwendolyn as this sweet old lady who, whenever they saw her, she would give them sweets and biscuits, and now they've discovered her lying in a pool of her own blood. The boys immediately ran back up to the apartment where they'd been visiting family and told the two women that Gwendolyn had fallen over outside. The two women immediately ran down to go and help her, but Gwendolyn was so severely injured that she was disoriented. She had no idea what was going on, and she tried to fight them off, thinking that her attacker had come back to finish the job. The police were called, and upon arrival, they found her purse was open near her body and a significant amount of cash had been taken. They also found that her underwear and her pantyhose had been removed, but there was no evidence whatsoever of any sexual assault. They immediately had her rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately she died later that night. After her death, a postmortem exam was conducted by Dr. Johan DeFleu, and it was immediately evident to him that Gwendolyn had not simply fallen over. DeFleu found a laceration to the back of the skull, and also a fracture was in the midline, and this is super uncommon for a fall, because if you fall backwards, like just instinctively, human reflex is to like turn, see where you're falling, try to, bumper your fall. So basically, in order for her to have the injuries that she did, she would have had to simply just fall back, straight back, didn't try and turn around, no human reflexes whatsoever. So because of this, Dr. DeFleu believed that she had been struck to the back of the head. Unfortunately for police, it was a really hard crime to investigate because there were 0 witnesses. No one had seen anything, no one had heard anything, no one had seen anybody sketchy in the area, despite the fact that Gwendolyn lived on a busy main road and directly across from an active construction site. Nobody could provide the police with anything of value. And on top of that, the people that lived in Gwendolyn's apartment block actually washed the crime scene down, thinking that she had just fallen over and that they were doing a good thing. So there was 0 forensic evidence for police. 2 months later, the killer struck again. On the 9th of May in 1989, Lady Winifred Ashton, who was the widow of artist Sir William Ashton, left the Mossman RSL Club after having some lunch and playing some bingo. She stopped by the shops on her walk home to Raglan Street. As she entered the foyer of her apartment, she was repeatedly attacked with a hammer thrown to the ground, and dragged into the bin room. Police found her lying in the bin room. She had a red raincoat on, her underwear and her pantyhose had been removed, and her pantyhose had actually been used to strangle her, leaving a 9-centimeter ligature mark on her neck. She also had bruises on her nose, her temples, her neck, and both of her eyelids. There was an open wound on her cheek, and her walking stick and her shoes had been neatly placed by the foot of her body. Her purse was missing, but she still had her diamond ring, so police were just like a bit confused about the murders and the motive behind the murders, whether it was a robbery. After Lady Ashton's murder, the media got a hold of this case and started reporting on it and reporting on the similarities between Lady Ashton's murder and Gwendolyn Mitchell-Hill's murder, and the police immediately began a massive search. The search spanned over 400 square kilometers, and they canvassed over 2,000 homes in Mossman. There was a few witnesses who claimed to have seen a sketchy looking guy in the area, and he was described as a drug addict, as unkempt, untidy, with bad teeth. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Rod Milton was called in to form a psychological profile of the killer, and he said that people who committed crimes of this level are usually young. He likely lived locally, possibly had a military background, and likely had some peculiar relationship with a significant woman in his life. Police also theorized that the attacker was young due to the time of day that the attacks occurred and also the proximity from these murders to high schools, so police were definitely working closely with those high schools. About a month after Lady Ashton's murder, a neighbor checked her letterbox and found that her purse had been placed in there and was missing $100 in cash. Police found that the wallet had been found by a passerby at Ashton Park, which, little side note, was actually named after her husband. But anyway, police did a thorough search of that park and found nothing. Oh, and something I didn't mention is that, again, people washed down the crime scene thinking that she had simply fallen over. So once again, no forensic evidence for police. Due to the lack of forensic evidence, the fact that neither of these women had been sexually assaulted despite their pantyhose and underwear being taken off, and the fact that their purses had both been stolen and money had been taken out of there, police believed that the motive of these murders was greed or robbery. 5 months later, on the 18th of October in 1989, 86-year-old Doris Cox is walking along Spit Road in Mossman towards her retirement village. As she reached the secluded stairwell in front of her house, she was grabbed from behind and her head was slammed into a brick wall and she fell to the ground.
The victim walked along this stairway here, walked down onto the pathway, totally unaware that she was being followed by the killer. She reached a point here where she was grabbed from behind. The killer grabbed her hair and smashed her head into the brick wall here.
When she was found, she was rushed to the hospital and she did actually survive. Neighbours, however, did wash down the crime scene once again, thinking that she had simply fallen over and that they were doing a good thing and helping out by cleaning it up. Once again, wiping any forensic evidence from the scene. And to be fair, it wasn't until the next day that doctors became suspicious that this wasn't just a simple fall and called the police. Sergeant Dennis O'Toole was one of the main investigators on the previous 2 cases, so when he got the call, he rushed to the hospital thinking, great, finally an eyewitness after all of this time with no forensic evidence, people washing down the crime scenes, no witnesses. We finally have an eyewitness who can ID this guy and we can stop him before he hurts anybody else. Unfortunately though, Doris Cox suffered from dementia, so she was unable to help police. She actually had no idea what had happened to her and how she even ended up in the hospital. Despite their efforts, of course, police really weren't getting anywhere with the investigation because they had nothing to go off, so they decided to appeal to the public. And from these public appeals, they did have a few people come forward. Some witnesses had seen a young male in his late teens riding a skateboard outside the retirement village where Doris Cox was attacked at around the time that she was attacked. The witnesses helped police draw up a sketch, and this sketch was released to the media, and for the next few weeks, police tried to track this guy down with no luck. On the 2nd of November, 78-year-old Dorothy Binke was walking her shopping home down a quiet back street just off Longville Road in Lane Cove when she was approached by a man who seemed super polite and friendly and offered to carry her groceries home for her. When they got back to her apartment and he carried her groceries in, she offered for him to stay and have a cup of tea, but the man declined. Just a few minutes later, he was walking back down the back street toward Longville Road when he passed Margaret Powd, an 85-year-old widow who was walking home at the time. He turned around and followed her down the quiet back street and brutally attacked her from behind. He removed her underwear and pantyhose and also placed her walking stick and her shoes by her body. There were no witnesses, nobody saw this happen, nobody heard anything, and Margaret was left lying there in the back street in a pool of her own blood until schoolgirl Java Wilson found her. Java was on her way home when she saw Margaret, and originally she actually thought Margaret was a pile of rags, but once she got closer, she realized it was a woman lying in a pool of her own blood, and she immediately ran upstairs to her apartment to tell her mum. Her mum told her that the woman was breathing but just barely and to go and call an ambulance, and Margaret was pronounced dead in the ambulance. And once again, well-meaning neighbours who thought that she had just fallen hosed down the crime scene, removing any forensic evidence. A postmortem exam was conducted and it was found that her death was due to massive head injuries. However, they couldn't say exactly what type of weapon would have caused these injuries. So police had no murder weapon, no idea what murder weapon could have been used to cause these injuries, no forensic evidence, no witnesses, and no suspects except for this one skateboarding teen apparently who they had no idea who he was. And despite all of this, there was enormous pressure on them to solve this case from the police department, from the media, from the public before the killer struck again. The next day, the media was in a frenzy over this case, and that's when they dubbed the killer the Granny Killer. Police then set up an operations room in Lane Cove and were working around the clock, hardly sleeping, trying to solve the investigation. They'd been working for almost 2 days straight when the next murder occurred. On the afternoon of the 3rd of November, 81-year-old Olive Cleveland was sitting on a bench just outside the Wesley Gardens retirement village in Belrose, just enjoying the ocean views, when a man came and sat with her and tried to have a conversation with her. When Olive became uncomfortable, she got up and walked to the main building of the retirement village, and the man came up behind her and smashed her skull with a blunt weapon. He then pulled up her dress, removed her pantyhose, and used them to strangle her, and he strangled her so tightly that some of the material of the pantyhose got embedded into her neck. The man then goes through her handbag, takes $60, and places her handbag, her shoes, and her walking stick neatly next to her body. When staff found her body, they placed it in a small in-house mortuary, and once again, they believed that she had just fallen over and washed down the crime scene before police could even be notified. It is honestly the most frustrating case, and police of course were devastated when they found out that yet another crime scene had been washed up. I just find it so confusing because these murders were all over the news, all in the media, people knew about them, people were scared, so they find another elderly woman and they just think, yep, definitely not the granny killer that's all over the news. No, she definitely just fell over, definitely wasn't murdered, despite the fact that she has literal pantyhose embedded into her neck, definitely just a fall. Not suspicious at all. Let's wash the crime scene down again and not tell police. I don't understand. Now, by this point, Dr. Rod Milton sees a pattern emerging, so I'm going to read you a quote of what he said. The use of the pantyhose seemed to me to unite his need to humiliate the victim sexually with his need to express violence. Because again, the violence used was excessive and seemed to say much more about the offender than that he was merely seeking to kill people. It seemed to say that there was this peculiar mixture of sexuality and the need to humiliate. Generally, the people who are neatest in our community are those whose training obliges them to be neat, and that means they have some kind of military training, and of course the victims, as we all know, were elderly, which suggests something about the offender's relationship with women in his own life. Now, as I mentioned, people by this point were scared, and when police were going door to door, canvassing the area, people would question them, be like, how do I know you're not dressed up as police? How do I know you're not just pretending to be a police officer? By the next day, on the 4th of November, the North Shore Murders Task Force was officially established and Inspector Mike Hagan was put in charge. There were 70 personnel put on the task force, including homicide investigators, district detectives, intelligence officers, analysis, computer experts, and forensic examiners. They also get John Laws, who is like a popular Australian radio host, and he's actually the host. If you remember my video on the Anita Cobby case, he's the same radio show host that managed to get a copy of the autopsy report that had been completely confidential, and he read it live on the radio because he believed that people needed to hear it. So police get him to do this appeal. I'll play a little clip of it now.
Did you see Lady Ashton that afternoon? Do you remember the lady with the red nylon raincoats and a walking stick? Did you see her being followed? To date, 4 defenseless elderly women have been brutally murdered.
And following this appeal, the state government offered a $200,000 reward for any information that would lead to the killer or killers of the 4 murdered women. Some members of the task force were working up to 20 hours a day at this point. Police held community meetings to instruct elderly citizens on personal security. Undercover officers posed as gardeners and workers at retirement villages. And due to the media coverage, police got a buttload of calls with tips. They checked every single one, but none led to anything.
The very next day, a jogger finds Mrs. Pard's stolen purse near a drain here at the Lane Cove Golf Course, where a week earlier it had been thrown by the granny killer.
And then on the 23rd of November, the killer struck again. 93-year-old widow Muriel Falkner had been living alone in her large house on Marston Street in Mossman for the past 39 years. Her neighbour Maggie Hughes had heard about the granny killer and was constantly trying to look after Muriel. She had voiced her concerns, especially considering Muriel didn't lock her back door at night, and Maggie was like, dude, lock your back door. But Muriel was an independent woman, and she said if someone breaks in, they just want money and I will give it to them. So on the 23rd of November, Muriel went for a walk down to the local shops. She got home at around 5 p.m. and as she opened her front door and entered her house, a man came up from behind her, put his hand over her mouth and repeatedly smashed her in the head and neck with a hammer. When she fell to the floor, the attacker began to remove her pantyhose, and as he did, Muriel regained consciousness and began to cry for help. So the attacker then repeatedly smashed her with the hammer until she finally passed out. He then removed her underwear and her pantyhose and used them to strangle her. He then searched her purse and the rest of her house and stole $100 in cash. The next day, Muriel's neighbours noticed that she hadn't collected her Meals on Wheels lunch. It was just sitting at her front door, so her neighbour Maggie decided to go and check out what was going on, see if she was okay, and she used a spare key to enter her house. Upon entering, Maggie noticed a full ice cream container was on the ground and her purse was on the table with the contents spilled out of it. She then noticed Muriel's body sprawled face down on the ground with blood pooling around her. And Maggie was actually a trained nurse, so she knew from the smell that she had not died recently. She then noticed that her shoes were placed neatly beside her body, her dress had been pulled up, and her pantyhose was still around her neck, and immediately Maggie thought of the granny killer. So police were obviously called, and because Maggie knew about the granny killer, because she knew that Muriel hadn't just fallen over, police finally had their first crime scene, and even better, they actually had some forensic evidence because the killer had actually stepped in Muriel's blood and tracked bloody footprints all throughout the house. The bloody footprints also suggested that the shoes the killer was wearing were typically worn by older people, not a younger person like police had thought this whole time they were looking for. Detectives obviously didn't want the killer to find out that they had this forensic evidence because they didn't want him to dispose of the shoes, so they told Maggie not to tell the media, they didn't tell the media, they didn't release this information to anybody, and they actually also tried to throw the killer off. There was like a construction site next door, so they went next door to the construction site, they took a bunch of like plaster casts of footprints there and released that to the media saying that they had found some muddy shoe prints next door, just kind of like throwing him off so he would think that he got away with it and wouldn't like try and dispose of any weapons, of any shoes, because they obviously needed that to tie him to the crime. But a few days later, despite having an intact crime scene, police really weren't getting anywhere. So Sergeant Paul Tuxford goes to question Maggie again, see if there's anything they missed in their initial interview or if she had seen anything sketchy the day that Muriel was murdered, and that's when she tells them that she had seen a portly, middle-aged, grey-haired man who was wearing a silver suit in the area. So Tuxford goes back to the task force and he gets the computer expert expert to look into the database and look for any crime reports regarding grey-haired men in the last 6 months on the lower North Shore, and Bob's your uncle. They find all of these reports about a grey-haired man who had assaulted women, who had pushed them over and stolen from them. One of the reports was about an 85-year-old woman named Margaret Todd Hunter. She was walking down the street when a man walked past her, turned around, hit her in the back of the head, and then while she was down on the ground, he grabbed her handbag and ran away. Margaret did survive. She did have to have 8 stitches as a result of the attack, and in the investigation, she had since moved to Queensland, so police flew over to question her, and she was able to give them a really good description of this guy. She said he was around 50 years old, 5'7" with grey hair, he was well kept, had broad shoulders, a thick chest, large stomach, and wore a white business shirt and cream trousers. And through her description, they were able to draw up a sketch of this guy. Another one of the reports that was of interest to police was that of 82-year-old Euphemia Carney. On the 25th of August in 1989, when returning to her home at the North Haven Retirement Village, she was punched in the chest and knocked to the ground. Her attacker was a grey-haired man, and he took her handbag and drove away in a blue car. As a result of the attack, she had severe bruising to her ribs, her chest, and the back of her head. She was also able to provide police with a thorough description of her attacker, and it matched Margaret's to a T. Another report found that on the 24th of June in 1989, an elderly patient staying at the Caroline Chisholm Nursing Home in Lane Cove reported that a grey-haired man had put his hand up her dress while she was laying on her bed and fondled her butt. This man then went to a neighbouring room and slid his hand down the front of another patient's nightdress and stroked her breasts. Despite these reports, police really struggled to identify this grey-haired man. Christmas of 1989 comes and goes, and the government ups the reward from $200,000 to $250,000. And then on the 11th of January in 1990, an elderly patient at the Greenwich Hospital named Daisy Roberts was assaulted. Daisy was in hospital suffering from advanced cancer when a grey-haired man claiming to be a doctor entered her room, put his hands under her nightdress and held her breasts, claiming that she was losing body heat. After the assault, Daisy rang the buzzer next to her bed, and Sister Pauline Davis went to go and check out what was going on, and as she was walking through to the ward, she found this grey-haired man, and she was like, "Who the hell are you? What the hell are you doing here?" And he immediately fled the scene. Sister Davis, though, absolute legend, chased him down and managed to get the registration off his car as he was running away. She contacts police, and 2 officers are sent over to question those who were working there about what had happened, and these 2 officers are not from the Granny Killer Task Force. This is a completely unrelated inquiry, nothing to do with the Granny Killer at this point. They haven't been correlated. So the 2 uniformed policewomen that were brought in were able to determine that the man who assaulted Daisy was a local 4 and 20 pie salesman named John Wayne Glover. The next day, police go to question Glover, and he basically says, "Look, I'm not going to say anything without my solicitor present," but he did agree to go and meet with police with his solicitor the next day on the 13th of January. The next day rolls around and he doesn't show up for his interview, which is supposed to be at 5 p.m. So they wait about an hour, and then at 6 p.m. they call his home phone. His wife Gay answers, and she tells them that he has actually attempted suicide because of the outlandish allegations that the police were accusing him of, and he was at the Royal North Shire Hospital. At this point, this is still totally unrelated to the granny killings, right? Like, I don't even think the task force knows about this particular assault. So they're treating this obviously like an unrelated assault. So 2 officers who obviously aren't on the task force head out to the hospital, and it's there that a doctor hands them his suicide note. And this suicide note says things like, "No more grannies," and "Gay, don't try and understand, Essie started it." And Essie is Glover's wife's mother, right? Like, hello, red flag. Anyway, due to Glover's mental state at the time, officers weren't allowed to question him, and they came back the next day to question him, and he said he wasn't going to say anything based on the legal advice that he had gotten. He did, however, admit to being at Greenwich Hospital, so the officers are like, "Hey, can we take a Polaroid photo of you just so we can go and show it around the ward and, try and match who it was that was wandering around the hospital that day?" And he actually allowed them to take the Polaroid. The officers took this Polaroid to the hospital, where Daisy Roberts and Sister Davis confirms that the man in the Polaroid, John Glover, is the man who assaulted Daisy. Unfortunately, though, the Polaroid and suicide note are then filed away when the investigating detective on the case is required to complete a 2-week training course. And then after a few weeks, the officer who took the Polaroid finally realizes, hey, this might be related to the granny killings, and she goes and hands it over, that and the suicide note and everything, over to the North Shore Murders Task Force. Immediately, members of the task force see the similarities between the Polaroid photo of John Glover and the sketches that had been drawn up by the other victims of the granny killer. And they also receive the suicide note at this time, and they find out that Glover is impotent, and detectives speculate why the victims were found in such sexually degrading poses. So immediately police were like, yeah, damn, this is the dude. John Glover is now their prime suspect. They put him under 24-hour surveillance, but he quickly became suspicious of this. Like, he would start driving around the block 2 or 3 times and going the wrong way down one-way roads just to see if anyone was following him. So police had to put a tracking device on his car so that the detectives surveilling him could kind of hang back so he wouldn't be so suspicious. So let me quickly tell you a little bit about John Wayne Glover. He was born on the 26th of November in 1932 in Wolverhampton, England, and growing up he had a very troubled relationship with women, particularly older women in his life, and especially his mother Frida, who had several husbands and many boyfriends. He began committing petty crimes from age 15 and left school early to join the British Army. However, he was kicked out of the army when they learned about all of his past, criminal convictions. In 1957, he migrated to Australia, living in Melbourne, and while there, police actually found in a background check that he had been convicted of 2 counts of indecently assaulting women, 2 counts of assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and 5 counts of larceny from 1957 to 1965. In 1968, he met his wife Gay Rolls and moved with her to Sydney, where they lived in a house in Mossman, which was actually owned by Gay's parents Essie and Jack, and Essie and John did not get along. Essie thought that John was punching way above his weight and she didn't like him. Fair enough, I can see that she had some good reasons. So when Gay and John moved into Essie's house, the feelings between them, the hostility between them, just intensified. John Glover's mother did follow him to Australia in 1976, however she died of breast cancer in 1989. Gay's mother Essie also passed away before the granny killing started. Okay, so back to the case, police are surveilling him and tracking him, but he doesn't really know at this point. Even though he's was a little suspicious at one point, he doesn't know they're tracking him. And while police are tracking him, they're also obviously investigating other leads. They're investigating him separately to the surveillance, and they're going to different nursing homes, questioning them and seeing if they had any indecent assaults recently. And then one detective goes into the James Milson nursing home at Kirribilli and asks the secretary if they had seen a man fitting Glover's description, right? And they don't say his name or anything like that, but then the secretary goes, oh, does this person work at 4 and 20 Pies? And is his name John Glover? And the detective is like, what the heck? Yeah, good for me. I don't have to, rely on physical identification. They obviously know this guy. He must have committed an assault here. But then the secretary says, that's my husband. And it turns out it was John Glover's wife, Gay. And immediately police are like, oh shit, I hope she doesn't go and tell her husband what's going on, the fact that they're investigating him and looking into assaults that he may have committed. And their fears were right, because she did. She went and told him immediately. She believes he's done nothing wrong. She believes police have got the wrong guy. They're trying to pin all of this stuff on him. And so she also goes and hires a solicitor for him named Don Wakeling. So 4 days after this happens, on the 19th of March in 1990, the surveillance has been going for 6 weeks by this point. Glover calls his work and he tells them he's not going to be coming in that day, and then he goes to a bottle shop and he buys a bottle of scotch. He then goes to a house in Beauty Point and goes up, knocks on the door of this house, and is let in by a woman who obviously knows him. Police have been following him and they take up positions around the house, and as the day goes on, hours pass, he's still in the house, but there's been no movement in this house, and police obviously start to get a little suspicious. They find out that the house is owned by 60-year-old divorcee Joan Sinclair, who seems to be a close companion of Glover's. That afternoon, 2 young kids go up to the front door and they knock on the door, and they wait a while and nobody answers the door, so they just go next door. And obviously police are like, okay, something weird is going on here. Joan Sinclair owned a couple of dogs and they were barking pretty loudly, so police kind of used that as an excuse to go to the house, pretend that they were going there for an excessive noise complaint. And they went to the front of the door, they knocked on the door, no response. They went round to the back of the door, which I believe was unlocked because they looked inside and found a hammer. And as soon as they found that hammer and saw a body sitting in the hallway, they immediately left the house and called the task force detectives, like the leaders of the task force. Sergeant Detective Dennis O'Toole was one of the task force officers that arrived, and he, along with 3 other detectives, Paul Magga, Murray Burns, and Paul Jacob, enter the house via the back door with guns drawn. They see the hammer and they see the body in the hallway, and the body was that of a woman, and she was clearly already deceased. They continued to search the house for Glover and found him in the bath. The bathtub was full, and in the bathroom they found some pills mixed with scotch that he had obviously taken to try and end his own life. They also found a broken glass which he had used to try and slit his wrists. Glover had actually vomited in the bath, so the bath water was all full of his vomit. It's likely he vomited due to the pills and the whiskey that he had taken, and that saved his life. He was barely breathing when they found him. Emergency services were called and he was rushed to the hospital. Investigators then discovered that Glover had arranged to take Joan Sinclair, his companion of 18 months, out to lunch. Instead, he murdered her in a similar way to the rest of the victims of the granny killer. She sustained severe head injuries caused by a blunt object, and she had been strangled with her pantyhose. And lying near her body was a hammer. And it was discovered that this hammer had been used in all of the previous granny murders as well. The reason that investigators were unable to determine that the murder weapon in the rest of the murders was a hammer was because he likely covered it with some sort of towel or something to soften the blow, which dramatically changed the blood spatter patterns as well as the actual injuries themselves. Back at the hospital where Glover was being treated for his overdose, detectives Murray Burns and Paul Jacobs were on watch. Glover regained consciousness in the early hours of the morning, and when detectives were speaking to him, he started talking about the similarities between his mother-in-law and the victims of the granny killer. It wasn't like an outright confession or anything, but it was enough that the detectives then called Dennis O'Toole and Paul Magga, who immediately rushed to the hospital. And once they arrived, Glover admitted to everything. The confession was recorded in a police notebook, and Glover signed every single page. Police then call Glover's wife Gay and tell her what's happened, that charges will likely be made, and she immediately calls the solicitor Don Wakeling, who rushes to the hospital. When Wakeling arrived, Glover made it clear that he wanted to make the statement and he wanted to get all of this off of his chest. And as he was making his confession, one of the officers said that he said it in such a matter-of-fact way. He spoke about the murders like he was making a cup of tea, not confessing to literally brutally murdering elderly women. He told them that after he would commit these crimes, he would take the money that he stole from the victims and he would go to the RSL club and he would buy himself drinks, he would buy his friends drinks, he would buy lunch, he would put some of the money on the pokies, and he would even buy drinks for elderly women. Police go and search Glover's house, obviously, and while they're there, they actually find shoes that match the footprints that were left at the murder scene of 93-year-old Muriel Falconer. Later that night, Glover is officially charged with the murder of Joan Sinclair and is remanded in custody.
Task Force detectives returned to the murder scenes with Glover, and there he freely describes in gory detail how he stalked and killed his victims.
On the 28th of March in 1990, 57-year-old John Wayne Glover appears under heavy guard at Glebe Coroner's Court, where he is formally charged with the 6 murders as well as a string of assaults. Despite his early confession, he pleads not guilty on the grounds of diminished responsibility. And the problem with this case is that a lot of people believe that in order to go around smashing little old ladies in the head with hammers, that obviously there has to be something wrong with you in the head, right? The prosecutor on this case was Wendy Robinson QC, and the trial began on the 18th of November in 1991. The defense put up 2 psychiatric experts who gave evidence that they believed Glover had built up hostility and aggression since his childhood against his mother and then against his mother-in-law, who was said to trigger him, and then when his mother-in-law Essie died, he had to take his aggression out on somebody else. Prosecutor Wendy Robinson QC, however, argued that Glover was well aware of his actions. That when he killed, he was planning what he would do with the victim's money. He took the time to clean the hammer with hydrochloric acid, and Glover would carry the hammer in his car so that it would be there when he found a victim. After each crime, he would go home and burn the gardening gloves that he used throughout the attack. He would then wash the hammer down with hydrochloric acid, and he would then take it down to his back shed and wash it again down with water. As I mentioned earlier, he was impotent and had no interest in sex, so him using pantyhose to tie around and strangle his victims was likely due to aggression and to make sure they were dead, and also to throw police off to make them think that this was a sexually motivated crime. It may also have been used to sexually humiliate his victims because he was unable to have sex. At the end of his sentence, the jury deliberated for a few hours before coming back and finding him guilty on every single charge that he was accused of, and he was sentenced to life in prison, never to be released. And this is what the presiding judge said upon his sentencing. He is able to choose when to attack and when to stay his hand. He's cunning and able to cover his tracks. It is plain that he has chosen these moments carefully. Although the crimes have been opportunistic, he has not gone in where the risks were overwhelming. The period since January 1989 has been one of intense and serious crime involving extreme violence inflicted on elderly women, accompanied by theft or robbery of their property. On any view, the prisoner has shown himself to be an exceedingly dangerous person, and that view was mirrored by the opinions of the psychiatrists who gave evidence at his trial. I have no alternative other than to impose the maximum available sentence, which means that the prisoner will be required to spend the remainder of his natural life in jail. It's inappropriate to express any date as to release on parole. Having regard to those life sentences, this is not a case where the prisoner may ever be released pursuant to order of this court. He is never to be released. Despite his sentence, detectives actually believe he may have been involved in a number of other crimes and 7 other murders, 4 in Victoria and 3 in New South Wales. Detective Dennis O'Toole continued to visit Glover in prison over the next several years to try and quiz him about these unsolved murders, try and get him to confess. On the last visit O'Toole made to Glover, Glover actually handed him a sketch he'd drawn, and originally O'Toole declined, but Glover insisted that he take it. Glover asked him if he was aware of the pine trees at the front of the Medlow bath, and so looking at the pine trees in the sketch, O'Toole saw what appeared to be the number 9. No one has any idea what it means, if it means anything at all. I don't know, could it be his way of admitting that he was involved in 9 other murders, or that there were 9 actual murders in total? I guess though that we'll never know, because after O'Toole's visit where Glover handed him the sketch, Glover actually ended his own life by hanging himself in his jail cell on the 9th of September in 2005. But that is all of the information that I have on this video. I would love to chat with you guys about your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you guys think the number 9 in the sketch meant? Do you think that it means he was responsible for 9 murders in total, or did it mean anything at all? Did it mean maybe he's responsible for 9 murders on top of the ones he was convicted of? I would love to hear your thoughts. But that is the end of this video. I really hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully I will see you in my next one. Bye guys!